We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for? Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. This is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And today we're going to be talking about a case study we published recently on the costs of large-scale illegal immigration, and specifically the costs generated by the Biden administration's policies, resulting in the settlement, or at least temporary settlement in the United States, of well over 3.5 million people who were in custody and then released, and millions of others who came in without being detained, but came in because the administration had the Border Patrol chasing its tail and wasn't able to actually keep these illegal immigrants out of the country. So the state specifically we published on was Massachusetts, both to shine a light on the specifics of the costs that Massachusetts is facing because of the Biden administration's policies, but then also as a case study more broadly about how other states and other jurisdictions face enormous costs from this mass illegal immigration that the Biden-Harris administration has created. And obviously it'll change because different policies in different states, but broadly speaking, there's a lot of commonality, and the report also offers some solutions, at least not to the broad problem, which is too much immigration and not enough immigration enforcement, but at least ways that states might be able to minimize the fallout of the Biden-Harris administration's policies. So to talk about this, we have on the show this week Jessica Vaughan, who is a director of policy studies here at CIS, who's the author of the Massachusetts report, a former resident of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts herself. This is a really useful and interesting report. It's on our website, cis.org, and it'll be in the show notes as well. And then to talk about one of the most significant and almost unremarked on aspects of the Biden-Harris immigration policies, we have on the line also George Fishman, who's a legal fellow here with the center, longtime staffer on Capitol Hill and in the Homeland Security Department, who wrote a piece for us called Parole with Benefits that is also on our site, and we will have a link in the show notes, about how in some instances immediately, in other instances eventually, the people that this administration has paroled in, these are inadmissible people, otherwise, they have no legal right to be in the United States, but they're let in under a narrow parole power, that they actually can become eligible for welfare under certain circumstances, and that this is part of the cost that not just Massachusetts will bear, but all states around the country. So to dive into it, Jessica, if we could start with you and just tell us what are some of the main points of this report about Massachusetts. We called it Massachusetts, a case study in mass immigration and the welfare state.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, there has been so much attention, rightfully, placed on the cost of the shelters and immediate support that the vast number of arriving illegal migrants have imposed on their destinations. And that's important. I mean, Massachusetts to date has spent $1 billion on its emergency shelter system, which is at least half occupied by new arrivals, either illegal border crossers or parolees. And other states have had similar costs.
Just so, so people listeners can connect that, the place that's been talked about most is New York City, where there's all these people they're putting up in hotels in New York City. That your point is, it's not just New York City. Massachusetts has dealt with, has spent $1 billion on its own version of that same policy.
That's right, which is a huge sum of money for, a state that is not in the top 5 usually in population or even illegal immigration. But it is a destination for a lot of the illegal migrants coming, in part, we think, because of the sanctuary policies of offering shelter to anyone who needs it.
Right.
And so there's been a lot of attention on that. They've had trouble coming up with the money. They've drained an emergency escrow rainy day fund, and they don't know where they're going to continue to get money. In fact, it's gotten so costly that Massachusetts is actually trying to offer free plane tickets to the illegal migrants to go somewhere else, which is pretty interesting. But nevertheless, many of them are going to stay there. Most of them are going to. But what few people have been focusing on is the long-term cost of supporting these newcomers.
Mm-hmm.
And that long-term cost is clearly going to eclipse the cost of the shelters.
Right.
And in the report, I go through what some of those long-term costs are and why this is happening. And the main reason this border crisis is so costly for Massachusetts and other sanctuary states and local governments and state governments in particular is that illegal immigration is very costly. For the 4 main costs are the cost of providing welfare benefits, the cost of providing medical care, the public safety costs that arise, and especially the cost of schooling.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of these illegal migrants are kids, whether they're coming with their families or coming as unaccompanied minors. And schooling is the biggest ticket item of all. Massachusetts has absorbed about 10,000 kids, illegally present kids, since Biden has taken office. And 8,500 of these kids are unaccompanied minors.
Wow.
And that just is a huge burden. In fact, the state's refugee and immigration agency, which mostly is, people think of it as being a refugee agency, they spend something like more than 80% of their budget on the unaccompanied minors, not legal immigrant integration, not, helping refugees. They're spending it on the unaccompanied minors. And again, a lot of this, of course, is due to the Biden open border policies, but some of this is self-inflicted because they have chosen to be a sanctuary, to offer shelter to all comers, to give driver's licenses to illegal immigrants, to protect criminal aliens from being arrested by ICE with their non-cooperation policies. So some of this is self-inflicted. But one specific aspect of the Biden-Harris border crisis that makes it so costly is the fact that they've chosen to allow these illegal migrants to enter with a grant of parole, which gives some of the folks who are coming in immediate access to benefits and others who will get access to welfare benefits after a 5-year wait. And that's what I've dubbed the fiscal time bomb that is awaiting all state governments beginning in 2026 because of the fact that so many have come in with a grant of parole.
And so if we could explore that issue a little more, since the time bomb it's a good image. George, why is there a time bomb? In other words, how is it that people let in on parole, which is supposed to be this temporary thing, emergency power just for, so you can testify at a hearing and then be escorted back to the border, or if you have some medical emergency, how is that turning into a vehicle for illegal alien access to welfare?
Well, it results from the collision of 2 totally separate and different topics. One is the parole program and rampant abuse of that parole program by the Biden administration. And second, the welfare reform law, which Congress passed in 1996 and President Clinton signed into law in 1996. And what happened was, as you said, Congress gave the president the parole power in 1952 in order to, in very unique circumstances, let the president allow an alien to come into the United States who, under the immigration laws as established by Congress, is inadmissible, it has no basis to be allowed into the United States. And Congress was thinking of things like medical emergencies and someone who needs to testify in a criminal trial. Those were the sort of things Congress had in mind. However, ever since then, administrations of both parties have been abusing the parole program to allow in hundreds of thousands of aliens who they would like to let in, but through which Congress has not provided an avenue, and basically a way to set up a parallel immigration law whenever they feel like it. But never has the abuse reached the level that it has in the Biden administration, with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of aliens inadmissible under the law being let in by the Biden administration, by DHS Secretary Mayorkas, and in some cases driven in on buses or allowed to fly into airports anywhere in the United States, as our colleague Todd Bensman has reported on. That's the abuse. And in the term of the Biden administration, more than 1 million aliens have been granted parole abusively. The other part of the abuse is aliens apprehended at the border are mandated to be detained by federal law, by law Congress has passed. And the Biden administration is vociferously opposed to detaining aliens, despite the fact that aliens who are not detained, who are apprehended and not detained, rarely ever get removed. They just become fugitives in the country. And you add that up, you got well over 1 million aliens with parole, courtesy of the policies of the Biden administration.
Right.
But then you go to the 1996 welfare reform law, which one of its main goals was to restrict access to federal welfare benefits to aliens, legal or illegal, in order to reduce the incentive for people to come here to access our welfare benefits, people who cannot provide for themselves and their families. And the way that law was written, certain aliens, primarily lawful permanent residents, have the best access to federal welfare programs,
right.
But even that is strictly limited in that essentially you generally have to be a permanent resident for 5 years, a lawful permanent resident for 5 years before you can be eligible for programs such as Medicaid and food stamps and things of that nature.
Right.
Interestingly, what Congress did in 1996 was to say if you've been granted parole and authorized for more than 1 year, you're considered in this special category of aliens called qualified aliens, just as if you were a lawful permanent resident. And Congress was, thinking of parole in the way it should be used, not in the way of the administration circumventing Congress to let in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of aliens. And so the result is that this 1 million+ group of otherwise inadmissible or illegal aliens under the Biden administration, they will be eligible on this special basis, this special level for federal welfare benefits, just as if they were permanent residents. In most cases, 5 years after they were given parole. And so within a year or two, the next administration, whether that's Democrat or Republican, the bill's going to come due, the check's going to come due, and these hundreds and hundreds of thousands of paroled aliens by the Biden administration are suddenly going to become eligible for the major federal welfare programs.
Right. In other words, the time bomb will start to go off. I had a couple of questions on that. First of all, why in the welfare reform bill, which, like you said, is supposed to limit alien access to welfare, why would they have made parolees eligible after a certain period of time? Because they're not supposed to be here that long anyway, in a sense. I mean, what was the rationale for that? Or was it just sort of one of those things that fell between the cracks?
That is an excellent question. I think it may have been something that fell through the cracks in part because of the view that, well, parole is just used primarily for these unique cases of humanitarian cases. Someone needs immediate life-saving surgery, comes into the U.S., has a family member who needs a transplant and they need to come in immediately. They have to testify in a criminal trial or assist law enforcement with the prosecution. It could be that that's what they had in mind. But interestingly, the way, and that's why it really ties in with what we're talking about here, the way Congress wrote those welfare changes in 1996, for instance, let's look at Medicaid. Congress wrote in the legislation, which became law in 1996, that the special category of aliens, qualified aliens, are eligible for Medicaid at the option of the state. So it's a joint federal-state program, so states can decide yes to do it, or no not to do it, at the option of the state in which they reside after the period of 5 years, beginning on the date of the alien's entry into the U.S. with a status within the meaning of the term qualified alien. And Congress wrote that presumably because that's what parole is for. That's what it was conceived of, to let people into the U.S. who otherwise couldn't get in to the U.S. But the way that was written, half of the population of parolees under the Biden administration didn't have parole when they came into the U.S. For instance, they came in illegally, were apprehended, and were released from detention on parole. Or through this thing called parole in place, they were a group of illegal aliens who the Biden administration decided, we want to give them some legal ability to stay in the country. Congress won't do it, so we'll just give them parole.
Retroactively, kind of.
Already in the country.
Right.
And so these people, under my reading of the welfare reform law, should never be eligible for federal welfare benefits because they never had the parole status when they came into the United States.
Interesting. Right.
Right. And that's what's so important here is that some of these people are being awarded after crossing the border illegally and then allowed to enter with parole after their entry into the United States.
I see. Yeah.
Others are like the people in some of the CBP-1 arrivals, who are coming, especially the ones coming directly from overseas. They are entering as parolees, not caught entering illegally and then being allowed to come in and wait with parole. And that's a big difference that I think is important, would be important to state governments, has a potential price tag on that interpretation.
Sure. But isn't it kind of moot, or could it be rendered moot if there's a new administration? Because parole is granted for 18 or 24 months, and it has to be renewed, right? So presumably they've been renewing people's parole, and if you just don't renew it, then that status disappears, right?
I think that is a key point, which will depend on who is elected president.
Yeah, right.
I would presume if Donald Trump is elected president, he'll almost immediately revoke the parole status of all these people. Not that it'll be necessarily easy to remove them from the United States, because most will go underground.
Sure.
But their parole status can be removed. But if Kamala Harris becomes president, I presume never in a million years would she revoke their parole status or not extend their parole status. And I would presume that even for those who didn't have parole when they came into the U.S., that her administration will decide to give them access to these federal welfare benefits anyway. And it'll be up to the states or someone else who can establish standing to sue the administration, to sue the Harris administration and say, that's not allowed by the federal welfare reform law, by the plain language of the federal welfare reform law, and we'll have to see how that plays out in court.
Interesting. So there's kind of two issues here. First of all, in the statute, it seems to me it's sort of outrageous that people on parole, even if they're here for 5 years, would be eligible for welfare, period. But then the other question that you're talking about that would be challenged in court is whether people who got parole retroactively, who entered illegally but then were paroled by the Biden-Harris administration, whether they are even eligible. That's the issue that the courts would have to litigate. So, Jessica, if we could go back to you, that's obviously a big part of the time bomb, is this 5-year thing for parolees getting access to welfare. And that would be 2026, I guess, because 2021 is when the Biden-Harris administration started. So 2026 is when people would start becoming eligible. But are there other long-term costs? In other words, let's say everybody gets out of the shelters, they're all given work permits, and so that part of the cost isn't there anymore. What are other long-term, kind of like time bombs, in addition to the parole issue that states like Massachusetts and others will be facing?
Well, that's right. Even if this influx at the border were stopped today, states are going to be on the hook for, and local governments too, frankly, and federal taxpayers, of course, too. All of us as taxpayers are going to be on the hook for the cost of this massive immigration event. And one reason is the 5-year clock on the parolees. Although I should add, some parolees are able to immediately get access to a lot of welfare benefits.
Right.
For example, if they're from Ukraine, Afghanistan, Haiti, Cuba, those countries are set up already to have access.
Because, just to interrupt, the reason is that Congress has kind of lumped them together with refugees, even though they're not formally refugees, and so they have the same access to welfare as refugees do.
Right. But people who are paroled from, India, Colombia, or, a lot of the other countries, I mean, we've had people come in from almost every country in the world. Those parolees are on the 5-year clock.
Right.
So that's going to come due soon. But even if these inadmissible migrants are working, even if they've applied for a work permit and are working, still we know from our colleague Steve Camerata's work that about 60% of illegal alien headed households are accessing welfare programs. And the reason for that is because their incomes are low. So even if they're working on a work permit, even if they're working illegally, if their income is low, they're going to start accessing welfare programs.
Especially on behalf of their U.S.-born kids.
Right. And that's another reason that this bill is going to come due. Something like 60% of the newly arrived illegal migrants who are women are going to have a child within the first 2 years.
Yep.
That's what one of my government sources told me.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of these illegal alien-headed or inadmissible migrant-headed households are able to access Medicaid, for example, through their U.S.-born child, not to mention prenatal care and postnatal care, which is considered emergency medical care that's mandated by federal law.
Right.
So that's going to be the cost that keeps on coming. That's why giving illegal migrants work permits is no solution to the cost. Because we are a welfare state, there are going to be costs for low-income workers.
Right. Just to put a bow on that, the issue is that if you're a less skilled worker, because you have low-level education, you're not going to earn a lot of money, and you're literally, in many cases, simply not able to feed your own children without the taxpayer funding it. And so there's no way around that. It's not even like there's an issue of sort of welfare cheats or whatever. It's just that the math is a harsh mistress. There is no way to square that circle. Anyway, so what was the next point?
We have a generous social safety net, and sanctuaries have an even more generous social safety net. So this other myth that's out there is that these programs like Parole are fine because the federal government is having people sign up to be sponsors for these migrants.
Right. This is, just to be clear, it's not all the parolees. I mean, in other words, it's certain parole programs. like the ones where they fly people in. When they just parole people out at the border, I don't think they have sponsors then, do they?
No, that's
Right.
true. But certainly the Haitians and Ukrainians
Right.
and some other groups are taking advantage of this program that was started by the Biden-Harris administration for so-called private sponsorship
Right.
for these migrants. And a lot of people think, well, that's, meaning that these people aren't going to be a burden on society. Well, as our colleague Nayla Rush has written much about, the so-called sponsors, even though they fill out detailed forms about their financial assets and willingness to sponsor these inadmissible migrants, it turns out that they don't actually have to provide any support whatsoever for these new arrivals. The notorious case in Massachusetts was this guy, Corey Alvarez, who raped a disabled girl in one of the migrant shelters, had a sponsor, and that sponsor was in New Jersey, and
Right.
obviously not providing any support whatsoever to this guy. And
So
that's
it's just
true of many of these
Yeah.
cases.
So the sponsorship thing is just a fake, basically a way to lipstick on a pig, I guess is how you'd put it. In other words, it's something to fool voters, but it doesn't have any real consequence. I mean, frankly, even the requirements, for instance, the resettlement groups, and this is not exactly the issue here, but refugee resettlement organizations they're contracted by the federal government, but even they only have to have like 3 months of responsibility. And so in a sense, what sponsorship really means broadly in the immigration context is you are required to drive the person you're sponsoring to the welfare office and sign them up. And at that point, you're off. Your sponsorship ends.
Well, but Mark, I feel that I agree with you. This is a meaningless exercise in paperwork and fooling the public. But I wonder if states couldn't use this sponsorship idea to try to address the eligibility question. I'm wondering if a state could decide to require anyone sponsoring a migrant to register with the state and provide a copy of their sponsorship form. And then the state could turn around and say, if one of these migrants applies for means-tested welfare benefits, why not count the sponsor's income as available to that migrant, which would change the calculation as to whether they really qualify based on their income?
Yeah, well,
just a thought.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, it's a thought, but unfortunately, the states hardest hit are going to be the states that are most likely to be sanctuaries and at least have that broad perspective, and therefore the least likely to do that.
I can dream.
Yeah, I know. There was the Bloomberg administration in New York City toward the end actually sent bills to people who had sponsored immigrants. This is people who sponsor regular green card holders. That's a separate thing, but it's the same concept. And those people they had sponsored had used welfare, and they actually researched it and sent bills to the people who'd sponsored them and said, okay, we paid these people this welfare, but you're on the hook for it. This is how much you owe us. And a lot of people, they paid up. And then he left office. It was the end of his administration, and the de Blasio administration came in and actually sent the money back to the sponsors.
Oh, my goodness.
So that they would not have to have been responsible. So anyway, it's your idea is an interesting one. I want to go back to George. We're getting toward the end here. With regard to this 5-year time bomb for parole, he said one of the things, of course, is that if the administration changes, you could revoke the parole. And that would, at least for those who've been here less than 5 years, I guess, be a solution. Although that would mean the ones who were here 5 years or more, if they still were on parole, they just become illegal aliens again. But is there a more lasting solution? Something actually changes to make to either the immigration statute or the welfare statute to make sure this kind of parole time bomb doesn't exist in case there's a future administration that tries to abuse parole?
I think definitely that Congress should modify that sentence in the 1996 welfare reform law and no longer make parolees, whether they came in with parole or were given parole after they came to the United States, no longer consider them as specially qualified aliens as such as lawful permanent residents and just don't give them that access to federal welfare benefits in the first place.
Yeah, so we're talking, like what, 5 words or something, 10 words. In other words, it's a relatively minor tweak to legislation to fix this.
It would be a 1-page bill.
Right. And that, of course, assumes we leave parole in place. I mean, we're not doing another podcast here on parole itself, but that has been just almost ludicrously abused and is ripe for some kind of statutory fix, which we'll see if that happens or not. But it's going to depend on the outcome of the elections, both the presidential and congressional elections coming up in November. So thank you, Jessica and George. We kind of talked about 2 separate things, but they clearly intersect here. So, Jessica, your report on Massachusetts is a case study of how large-scale illegal immigration creates enormous costs for taxpayers is online. And George, your paper, which wasn't about Massachusetts, but was about the piece of it that parole is responsible for this looming enormous bill, potentially, that Massachusetts and other states are going to face in, about a year and a half, or at least starting to have to pay up in a year and a half, is also going to be online. It's Parole with Benefits, we called it. So thanks, both of you, for coming in, and we will keep following this issue.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us, Mark.
And finally, I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of interesting pieces we published this week. One was a kind of overview of the enormous changes that the Biden-Harris administration has made in refugee resettlement by one of our analysts, Nayla Rush. And the point here is that the administration can use refugee resettlement, which actually is a lawful program, to dramatically step up immigration into the United States. And they, in fact, have come up with a bunch of different ways of doing this. They've even developed a way for private individuals and universities and even companies to sponsor their own supposed refugees, whether they actually are refugees or not. So this really does point to where another, 4 or 8 years of this administration's policies really could lead the United States and lead our immigration policy, where the executive isn't just freelancing its own immigration policy through these parole programs, as we've seen at the border and elsewhere, but also using immigration as another tool to dramatically increase immigration, completely separate from any approval of Congress. And so this was a good overview of the changes the administration made. The other piece we published is kind of a companion piece looking at analyzing one of the specific ways the administration is doing this expansion, and that is through what they call Safe Mobility Offices, SMO. They've set them up in Latin America. They're opening more of them, and essentially they're recruitment offices for refugees and migrants of various kinds. So they're basically ways, the ostensible reason for them is so that people who would otherwise sneak across the border don't undertake the cost and risk of doing that. And people can just walk in and say, "Hi, I'm a refugee," and they may just get refugee status and be flown to the United States. Or if they don't qualify, they'll say, "Okay, well, let's look for some other way of getting you into the United States," ultimately maybe even just bringing them in through these legally dubious parole programs that the Biden-Harris administration has concocted. And so both of these reports really point to this administration's perspective that not only that immigration is good, but that more immigration is good, and even more fundamentally, that everyone in the world needs to have an opportunity to come to the United States if they want to. It's really a radical perspective on immigration that doesn't really look at the issue from the perspective of the interests of Americans, but rather from the perspective of the interests of the potential migrants. That's what's most important, is that everyone who wants to come here has some means of doing so. And that's the kind of fundamental difference in perspective that the immigration debate should be grappling with, along with the important but lesser issues of costs and even things like criminal justice and all the rest of it. Those are all essential issues. We at the center write about them, talk about them all the time. But really the basic question is, should immigration policy be made in the interest of Americans, or should it be made in the interests of foreigners? And these two pieces that we published really shed some light on how this administration views immigration as a kind of a service to foreigners abroad rather than a way of promoting the interests of the people who ostensibly this government represents. So that's it for this week's episode of Parsing Immigration Policy. Like and review us if there's a way to do that on your podcast platform. And even whether there is or not, feel free to just email us at center@cis.org with any compliments, complaints, or even suggestions for future shows. So until next week, this is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies, signing off for Parsing Immigration Policy.